The AI model you think is the smartest might be gaming the test. Right now, every major AI company is publishing benchmark scores to prove their model is superior, and you're probably seeing those numbers everywhere. GPT-4 scored 90% on this. Claude crushed that. Gemini beat both of them on this other thing. But here's the problem. Those benchmarks are not measuring what you think they're measuring, and the companies running them know it. Let me break down how this actually works. A benchmark is basically a test. You give an AI model a set of questions or tasks, it tries to solve them, and you score how many it gets right. Sounds simple, right? But the devil is in the details, and the details are where AI companies are hiding the real story. First, let's talk about what benchmarks actually test. Most of the famous ones, things like MMLU, which tests knowledge across math, science, history, and law. They're measuring a very specific kind of ability. Can the model answer multiple choice questions about information it learned during training? That's it. They're not measuring whether the model actually understands anything. They're not measuring whether it can solve real-world problems. They're not measuring whether it's honest or safe or useful for your actual job. They're measuring multiple choice performance on a fixed set of questions. Now, why does that matter? Because AI companies have figured out that if you optimize for a benchmark, you can make your model look amazing on that benchmark without making it actually better at anything you care about. This is called benchmark overfitting, and it's rampant. Here's a concrete example. GPT-4 was trained partly on data that included benchmark test sets. Not on purpose, necessarily. The training data is so massive that it's hard to avoid. But that means when you test GPT-4 on MMLU, you're not really testing whether it can answer those types of questions. You're testing whether it memorized those exact questions during training. It's like if your teacher gave you the exact exam questions a week before the test. You'd score higher, but it doesn't prove you learned the material. Then there's the issue of how benchmarks are designed and run. These tests are created by researchers, published, and then AI companies use them to benchmark their own models. But guess what? The companies making the models also have influence over which benchmarks get attention, how they're run, and how the results are reported. If a benchmark makes your model look bad, you can question its validity, propose changes, or just not report it. If it makes you look good, you publish it everywhere. I'll give you a real example. In 2023, some researchers found that you could improve a model's MMLU score by just rephrasing the questions slightly. Same questions, slightly different wording, sometimes better scores. That tells you the benchmark is measuring something fragile and artificial, not real understanding. There's also the problem of the benchmark zoo. There are hundreds of benchmarks now. MMLU, HelloSwag, Truthful QA, Human Eval, GSM 8K, the list goes on. And different models rank differently on different benchmarks. So companies can cherry-pick which benchmarks to report, focus on the ones where they rank highest, and ignore the rest. If you see a headline that says a new model is the best, that usually means it's the best on one specific benchmark that the company decided to publish. Then there's the issue of benchmark contamination, which is a fancy way of saying the model's training data included the benchmark. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, they've all acknowledged that their training data might include benchmark test sets. And once that happens, the score is basically meaningless. You're not testing the model's ability to solve problems. You're testing whether it memorized that specific test. But wait, there's more. Some benchmarks are designed in ways that accidentally favor certain model architectures or training approaches. A benchmark that's heavy on text classification might favor models trained a certain way. One that requires lots of reasoning might favor models with more parameters. So a high score on a benchmark might just mean your model is optimized for that specific type of task, not that it's smarter overall. Here's what really gets me. Even when companies are honest about benchmarks, they're usually only telling you about the benchmarks where they do well. You almost never see a headline that says, "Our model scored worse on this benchmark than the competitor." So the benchmark scores you see in the news are already heavily filtered and selected. Now, I'm not saying benchmarks are completely useless. They're useful for researchers who are trying to measure progress on very specific tasks. They can tell you, for instance, whether a new training technique helps with math reasoning. But they're terrible for answering the question everyone actually wants answered: which AI model is best? Because best depends on what you're using it for. If you're writing code, you care about human eval scores, which measure code generation. If you're trying to get factual answers, you care about truthful QA. If you're doing reasoning, you care about GSM-8K. If you're just having a conversation, none of these benchmarks matter much. They're all measuring narrow slices of ability. So what should you actually pay attention to instead? First, real-world performance. How does the model actually perform on your task? Not on a benchmark, on the actual thing you're trying to do. Second, user reviews and community feedback. If thousands of people are using a model and saying it's great for X, that's more reliable than a benchmark score. Third, transparency. Does the company tell you how the model was trained, what data went into it, and which benchmarks it's good and bad at? If they're hiding anything, that's a red flag. And here's the thing. Even the companies making these models know benchmarks are misleading. They have internal metrics and tests that are way more sophisticated than what they publish. They know their model's real strengths and weaknesses. But publishing a comprehensive, honest assessment of a model's abilities is bad for marketing. It's much easier to publish benchmark scores, especially the ones where you rank highest. So the next time you see a headline that says a new AI model is the smartest, fastest, or best, remember, that score is probably measuring something very specific and narrow. The model might be great at multiple choice questions about facts it memorized, but that doesn't mean it's better at the thing you actually want to do. If you want to cut through the hype and understand what's actually happening in AI, not just the headlines, but the real story behind the numbers, subscribe. I break down this stuff regularly, and I don't just tell you what the benchmarks say. I tell you what they actually mean.